Hi everyone, it's Wednesday, June 24th. This is the dispatch for the week. I'll focus on a couple of the elements of the week's readings. We'll talk about the connection between Jews, Muslims, and Christians that goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. Also, we'll look at an example of the Apostle Paul getting so worked up that he actually gets a little bit salty in the way that he's talking. I'll have a couple of announcements and prayer concerns to share with you at the end as well. So we'll start with Genesis. A couple of the readings come from Genesis, in particular Genesis chapter 16. This is the story of the birth of Ishmael. You might remember the story of Abraham and Sarah, and God promises that by Sarah, Abraham will have innumerable descendants. But as Abraham and Sarah get older, they start to doubt that this is actually going to happen. So Sarah tells Abraham, take Hagar, your slave, and have a child by her. This was common in the ancient world. If a woman was barren, they would use a servant or a slave in order to ensure that there was someone to pass on wealth, the inheritance, the land to. So Abraham and Hagar have a son, Ishmael. Sarah becomes upset as soon as Ishmael is born and sends Hagar away. With Abraham's blessing, Abraham lets it happen. Hagar is sent away with Ishmael and nearly dies in the wilderness. But God appears to Hagar, and God promises that through her son, that she herself will have innumerable descendants. It's a promise that echoes the same promise that God has made to Abraham. It's a different lineage. God is still planning for Abraham and Sarah to have their own lineage through Isaac, who is not yet born. But God's making this extraordinary promise to Hagar, a slave woman, and Ishmael. But God, the angel of the Lord tells Hagar to go back to Abraham. Now, later on, when Isaac is born, then Sarah decides once and for all she's done with Hagar, doesn't want Ishmael around, and sends them away again. And they're in the wilderness and nearly die, but God rescues them. God makes a well appear for them, a well of water when they're about to die of thirst. And that well becomes a central part of the Muslim faith. Ishmael is understood to be the ancestor of Muslims. So Muslims trace their lineage back to Abraham through Ishmael. Christians and Jews trace their lineage to Abraham, of course, through Isaac. And in the case of Christians, it's more of a spiritual lineage than an actual one. But in any case, the three faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, are linked together in the person of Abraham. And through this story of Hagar and Ishmael, we bring Muslims into the fold, so to speak, of Abrahamic faiths, as we often say. So that's an important element of that story. Another thing to note is that when Hagar is first out in the wilderness with Ishmael and fearing for her life, she does something that no other person in the Old Testament does, or at least in the book of Genesis. She gives God a name. She names God El Roi, which means God sees, because she believes that God has seen her. God has recognized her need and her plight, and she names God. This is extraordinary. A woman who's not a Jew, not part of Abraham's family in any true sense. She's a slave and eventually will be sent away. She gives God a name. This is really extraordinary. It's a powerful story and worth spending some time with. So Genesis 16 is the first part of the story. The second part of the story is Genesis 21, if you want to go ahead to that story. Now let's look at Paul in the book of Galatians, because this is some language from Paul that ought to make us chuckle a little bit. In Galatians, Paul is really angry from start to finish. It's clearly his angriest letter. 1 Corinthians is a close second. But Paul is angry with the Galatian church over the issue of circumcision. The Galatian church is insisting that new converts to Christianity, Gentile converts to Christianity, be circumcised. Remember, Christians were first Jews, at least at the beginning. Jesus himself was a Jew. And so after Jesus, there was this tug of war between the law of Judaism and the influx of Gentile Christians who had never practiced the Jewish law. And in Galatia, they were emphasizing that law pretty heavily, insisting that people became circumcised. And Paul won't have any of it. And Paul gets really angry. And in chapter 5, he gets worked up into a froth over this theological issue. He says this, "Once again I testify to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obliged to obey the entire law. You who want to be justified by the law have cut yourselves off from Christ." Now these are strong words, but the pun is of course intended. The idea of being cut off from Christ because of circumcision. Something has been cut off. But it gets even better than this, right? We go to the next reading a little bit later in chapter 5. He says, "Whoever it is that is confusing you will pay the penalty. I wish that those who unsettle you would castrate themselves. I wish that those who unsettle you about this notion of circumcision would just go all the way and cut the whole thing off." It's hard to believe that Paul is talking this way in the Bible, but that's how important the issue of circumcision is for Paul. For Paul, either we rely on Christ or we rely on ourselves. And there's not much, there really is nothing in between. There's no middle ground. We don't rely on the law and on Christ. For Paul, it's all or nothing. We either rely on Jesus, the grace of God, or we can still rely on the law. But we can't have it both ways. There are a couple other readings, of course, in there, so I didn't want to just try to tackle all of them. Let me give you a couple updates, a couple prayer requests. Tom Neff is expected to be released from the rehab facility where he has been for weeks. Tomorrow he's expected to be released and hoping to go home. So continued prayers for Tom and Marlene. We do hope that transition home happens as expected. Also ask your prayers for a little baby girl named Davy. This family has been worshiping with us for a time. Little Davy has tested positive for COVID, so she and her family are at home in quarantine, taking care of themselves, trying to feel better. So please pray for Davy and for the Laplow family. And then one quick announcement. We would love to have you share with us how you're feeling about the possibility of coming back to church in person. There's a survey that we're asking over the next week for people to fill out. Go to survey.milfordpc.org to fill out that survey and tell us how you're feeling. That will help us gauge where the congregation is right now. We are moving toward developing that plan, and as soon as the session has adopted this plan, we'll be sure to share it with everyone. But in the meantime, to have a sense of how you're feeling would be very, very helpful to us. Go to survey.milfordpc.org. That's it for today. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you Sunday.